My trip to Glacier National Park with friends turned into a nightmare when we found an abandoned tent near our campsite. It seemed recently used, but no one was there. Then the whispers started, calling our names, and shadows began creeping closer. Tyler disappeared, and Jessica was pulled into the glowing tent. We tried to destroy it, but it kept reappearing, trapping us in a relentless cycle. In the end, I saw my frozen reflection in the tent and realized we could never escape its chilling grip. The phantom of the Snowbound Tent. I've always thought there's a kind of beauty in isolation, the way silence can make the world feel sharper, more vivid. That was the promise Glacier National Park offered when we planned this trip, a retreat from noise, deadlines, and endless pings from our phones. It was supposed to be an adventure, just 5 of us, roughing it in the snow-covered wilderness. What we didn't know was that some silences are alive. Some silences watch. The trip was Tyler's idea. He was the adventurous one, always dragging us into the kind of escapades that sound better in hindsight than in the moment. Glacier National Park in January, he'd said with his trademark grin, "It'll be incredible. Just us and the mountains." It was the kind of logic only Tyler could sell. Jessica, his girlfriend, was on board immediately. She never said no to him. Rachel, my closest friend, was excited about the photography opportunities. Mark and I, on the other hand, took a little more convincing. Mark was the practical one of the group, always worried about logistics, and I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I figured a change of scenery might help me find it. The drive into the park was breathtaking. Snow blanketed everything, turning the world into a monochrome dream. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of more snow, but the mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting through the clouds. As we wound our way deeper into the wilderness, cell service disappeared, leaving us with only the crackle of the radio and the sound of our own voices. When we reached the trailhead, Tyler parked the SUV, and we began unloading our gear. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that bites through layers and sinks into your bones. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck, watching my breath plume out in front of me. "This is going to be amazing," Tyler said, shouldering his pack. "We'll be the only ones out here." "Gee, I wonder why," Mark muttered, his voice muffled by his scarf. We started up the trail, our boots crunching through the snow. The first few miles were manageable, the path clearly marked and relatively flat. But as we climbed higher, the trail grew narrower, the snow deeper. The trees around us were tall and ancient, their branches heavy with ice. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or the distant cry of a bird. We reached the campsite just as the sun was starting to set. It was a small clearing near the edge of a frozen river, surrounded by towering pines. Tyler set to work pitching the tents, while Jessica and Rachel started a fire. I wandered a little way from the group, drawn by the stillness of the river. The ice was thick, its surface dusted with snow, and the trees on the opposite bank were reflected in the glassy surface. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards upriver, something bright caught my eye, a splash of color against the endless white. I squinted, trying to make it out. It was a tent, partially buried in the snow, its fabric faded but still intact. There was no movement around it, no tracks leading to or from it. "Hey, guys," I called over my shoulder. "There's a tent up here." Tyler and the others joined me, their boots crunching through the snow. Tyler's eyes lit up when he saw the tent, his curiosity piqued. "Think someone's camping out here?" he asked. "There's no car at the trailhead," Rachel pointed out. "And no footprints. It doesn't look recent." We approached the tent cautiously, the snow crunching underfoot. Up close, it was clear the tent had been there for a while. The fabric was weathered, the edges crusted with ice. But there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. Someone left this in a hurry, Jessica said, pulling back the flap. Inside, we found a strange tableau. A kettle sat on a small camping stove, and a plate of food was laid out on a collapsible table. A sleeping bag was unzipped, as though someone had been about to crawl inside but never got the chance. The food wasn't frozen. The water in the kettle wasn't ice. "That's impossible," Mark said, his voice tight. "It's been freezing out here all day." "Maybe they just left," Tyler suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Where would they have gone?" I asked. "There are no tracks." The silence stretched, heavy and uneasy. Rachel picked up a notebook from the table, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. She flipped through it, her brow furrowing. "It's a journal," she said. "Looks like it belonged to whoever was staying here." "What's it say?" Jessica asked. Rachel hesitated, then began to read aloud. Day 1, arrived at the campsite. It's colder than expected, but the view makes up for it. Day 2, heard something outside the tent last night. Probably just an animal, but it sounded off. Day 3, the noises are getting closer. Can't see anything when I look, but I can feel it watching. Day 4, she stopped, her face pale. "What?" I asked. "What does it say?" She turned the notebook toward us, and I saw the last entry. It wasn't a complete sentence, just 2 words scrawled hastily across the page: "It's here." A shiver ran down my spine, and I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. Tyler shrugged, though his forced grin betrayed his nerves. "Probably just a prank," he said. "You know how people are." "Who'd come all the way out here to pull a prank?" Mark asked, his voice tight. Before anyone could respond, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into twilight. The shadows stretched long and dark, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. "We should get back to our camp," I said, trying to shake off the unease. As we turned to leave, I glanced back at the tent one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow moving inside, flickering in the light of the lantern. But when I blinked, it was gone. We returned to our own camp in silence, the unease following us like a second shadow. That night, as we sat around the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The darkness pressed against the edges of the clearing, and every crack of a branch made my heart jump. I told myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing out there. But deep down, I knew better. Something was watching us. And it had been watching for a long time. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, but the warmth did little to ease the chill that had settled over our group. We sat in a tight circle, the tension thick enough to choke on. Tyler tried to lighten the mood, cracking a joke about the journal being creative writing for the wilderness, but no one laughed. We couldn't unsee what we'd found in the abandoned tent, or forget the creeping unease that had followed us back to camp. The temperature seemed to drop even further as the night deepened. The fire, despite its size, barely seemed to push back the cold. My breath fogged in front of me, the condensation freezing to the edges of my scarf. Mark broke the silence first. "Did anyone else see that shadow?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant, as if speaking the thought aloud might make it real. Jessica and Rachel exchanged nervous glances, but no one answered right away. Finally, I nodded. "I thought I saw something, too," I admitted. "Inside the tent. Just for a second." "It wasn't just you," Rachel said quietly. "I saw it, too." Tyler let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head. "Look, we're spooking ourselves. It's an old tent, okay? It's creepy, sure, but there's no one out there." "Then where's the person who left all their stuff behind?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling. Before Tyler could answer, a sound cut through the night, a faint crunch, like footsteps in the snow. We all froze, the blood draining from my face. It was unmistakable, the steady rhythm of someone, or something, walking just beyond the edge of the firelight. My eyes darted toward the darkness, but all I could see was the vague outline of trees, their branches swaying in the wind. Probably an animal, Tyler whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. Rachel's voice was barely audible. Too heavy for an animal. The crunching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the fire and our shallow breathing. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, a soft, melodic hum drifted toward us. It wasn't the wind. "What the hell is that?" Mark hissed, his knuckles white as he gripped his flashlight. The hum grew louder, resolving into something like a tune, a haunting lullaby carried on the cold air. It was both beautiful and chilling, the kind of sound that made your hair stand on end. It didn't feel right, it didn't feel human. Jessica grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my jacket. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Go where?" Tyler snapped. "We're in the middle of the wilderness. We can't just." The singing stopped abruptly, as if cut off by an unseen hand. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavier than the cold. And then, from the direction of the abandoned tent, a faint glow appeared. It was the lantern. The one we'd seen inside the tent earlier. The light flickered, swaying gently, as if someone, or something, was holding it. The outline of the tent was barely visible in the distance, but the light was unmistakable. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt the others tense beside me. "Who lit that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "No one," Mark said grimly. "We were the last ones there." "Maybe we weren't," Tyler said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He grabbed the hatchet we'd brought for firewood, holding it like a lifeline. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No!" Jessica practically shouted, grabbing his arm. "Are you crazy? We're not splitting up." But Tyler was already stepping away, his jaw set. "It's probably just some other campers messing with us. I'll be back in 5 minutes, okay?" Before anyone could stop him, he disappeared into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bouncing as he moved. Jessica called after him, but he didn't turn back. We sat there in tense silence, the fire crackling weakly. The glow of the lantern remained steady in the distance, but there was no sign of Tyler. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching into eternity. Then the singing started again. This time, it was closer. Much closer. I stood, my heart pounding, and scanned the trees with my flashlight. The beam flickered, cutting through the shadows, but there was nothing there. The singing grew louder, circling us, though the source remained unseen. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was several, overlapping in a dissonant, haunting melody. "What is that?" Rachel whispered, clutching her camera like a shield. Before I could answer, a figure appeared in the distance, just beyond the firelight. It moved toward us slowly, its gait jerky and unnatural. "Tyler?" Jessica called, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, and I felt my blood turn to ice. It was Tyler, but something was wrong. His face was pale, his eyes glassy, and his movements were stiff, almost mechanical. He stopped just at the edge of the firelight, staring at us without blinking. "Tyler?" I said cautiously, stepping toward him. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, his breath visible in the freezing air. Then he smiled, an eerie, hollow smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and strange. "I found something." Jessica stood, shaking her head. What are you talking about? Tyler, are you okay? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the abandoned tent, his movements stiff and robotic. Jessica started to follow, but I grabbed her arm, stopping her. That's not Tyler, I whispered, my voice trembling. What are you talking about? She snapped, but her voice wavered. Look at him. I hissed. He's not right. As if on cue, Tyler, or whatever it was, stopped. He turned to look at us, his glassy eyes reflecting the firelight. And then, without a word, he vanished into the shadows. We didn't sleep that night. None of us said it aloud, but we all knew something had come out of that tent, something that wasn't human. And it wasn't done with us yet. None of us spoke as the night dragged on, but the tension was suffocating. The fire sputtered, its light casting long, jittery shadows across the snow. Every now and then, someone would glance toward the abandoned tent, where the faint glow of the lantern still flickered, a cruel reminder of Tyler's disappearance. Do we go after him? Jessica finally broke the silence, her voice brittle, as if the words themselves might shatter her. Rachel shook her head, her hands trembling around her camera. No. Whatever that was, it wasn't Tyler anymore. We can't just walk into that. Then what do we do? Jessica demanded, her tone rising in panic. We can't just leave him. Mark, who'd been silent for the past hour, stood abruptly. We're not leaving him. But we need to be smart about this. If we all rush out there, whatever's in that tent could take us, too. You're assuming it hasn't already, Rachel murmured, her eyes darting toward the trees. I tightened my scarf, trying to push back the icy dread clawing at my chest. We need to stay together. If we split up... A loud crack interrupted me. It came from the edge of the campsite, where the firelight faded into shadow. We all froze, our breaths caught in our throats. Did you hear that? Jessica whispered, clutching my arm. The crack came again, louder this time, followed by a faint crunch of snow, like footsteps circling us. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my palms slick with sweat despite the cold. Who's there? I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The footsteps grew louder, moving closer, but the darkness revealed nothing. Just the sound, encircling us like a predator stalking its prey. Rachel raised her camera, snapping photos wildly, the flash cutting through the gloom. For brief moments, the forest lit up in stark relief, trees, snow, empty space. But then, on the fourth flash, something appeared. It was a figure, standing just beyond the trees, its features obscured by shadow. It didn't move, didn't flinch as the flash illuminated it. My heart thundered in my chest as I stared at it, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It's just watching us, Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Turn off the flash, Mark hissed, grabbing Rachel's arm. You're giving it something to follow. But before she could lower the camera, the figure moved. It stepped forward, its motion unnatural, like a marionette jerked on strings. The light from the fire caught its face, and I felt my stomach lurch. It was Tyler, or at least, it wore his face. But his eyes were empty, black pits, and his skin was pale and waxy, like frostbitten flesh. Tyler? Jessica's voice cracked as she took a hesitant step forward. Don't, I hissed, grabbing her arm. That's not him. The thing tilted its head, almost as if mocking us. Then, it opened its mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't a voice. It was a low, guttural groan, followed by a series of whispers, overlapping and discordant. The words were impossible to make out, but they carried a weight that made my knees weak, as if each syllable pressed against my chest. Jessica screamed, her hands flying to her ears. Stop it! Stop it! Run! Mark shouted, grabbing her and pulling her back toward the fire. I stumbled after them, Rachel close behind. The whispers grew louder, filling the air like a storm, until I thought my head might split open. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and erratic, and the thing that wore Tyler's face moved closer. We huddled around the fire, desperate for its warmth, its light. The whispers receded slightly, but the thing didn't stop. It circled the campsite, just beyond the firelight, its hollow eyes fixed on us. What does it want? Rachel whispered, clutching her camera like a lifeline. It wants us to follow, I said, my voice barely audible. It's trying to lure us to the tent. Mark cursed under his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the hatchet. We can't stay here. It's just playing with us. Then where do we go? Jessica demanded, her voice rising in panic. It's everywhere. Mark's eyes darted toward the trailhead. We make for the car. We leave now. It won't let us, Rachel said, shaking her head. You saw how it moved. It's not normal. We don't have a choice. Mark snapped. Either we run, or we wait for whatever that thing is to. A loud boom interrupted him, like a gunshot, echoing through the forest. The ground beneath us seemed to vibrate, and the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. We all turned toward the abandoned tent. The lantern had gone out, but the tent itself glowed faintly, as if lit from within by an unnatural light. Shadows writhed against the fabric, shifting and twisting in impossible shapes. That's where Tyler is, Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. We have to go. We can't leave him there. Jessica, no. I grabbed her arm as she started to move, but she yanked free, her eyes wild. He's in there, she shouted, running toward the tent. Jessica, wait. Mark and I ran after her, but the cold seemed to thicken around us, the air like syrup in our lungs. Every step was a struggle, the snow pulling at our boots like it was alive. Jessica reached the tent first, tearing open the flap. For a moment, she froze, her body rigid. Then she screamed, a sound so raw, so full of terror, that it didn't sound human. Jessica! I shouted, but as I reached her, something yanked her into the tent. She vanished into the glow, the flap snapping shut behind her. Mark grabbed my arm, dragging me back toward the fire. We can't help her. We have to go. But we'll die if we stay here, he snapped, his face pale with fear. The tent's glow intensified, and the shadows inside writhed faster, more violently. The air filled with a high-pitched keening, like metal scraping against ice. Then the whispers started again. Only this time, they were calling my name. We stumbled back to the fire, the warmth doing little to chase away the ice clawing its way into my bones. Jessica's scream still rang in my ears, mingling with the haunting whispers that now seemed to hover in the trees, circling us like vultures. She's gone, Mark said, his voice flat and hollow. He dropped to his knees, clutching the hatchet like a lifeline. It took her. She's not gone, I snapped, though my voice shook. We don't leave her. We don't leave anyone. Rachel huddled by the fire, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her camera. It's not just her, she whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. It's all of us. It wants us, all of us. Mark shot her a glare, his face pale and drawn. We're not going to die here. Then what do you suggest? Rachel snapped, her voice cracking. That thing is out there, and it knows where we are. I glanced toward the direction of the tent, its faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat in the distance. The shadows writhed and twisted, as if mocking us, daring us to come closer. Jessica was in there, she had to be. But the way she'd been pulled inside, the way the tent itself had seemed alive. I swallowed hard. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with," I said, trying to keep the fear from my voice. Whatever this is, it's tied to that tent. To whoever was in there before us." Mark let out a humorless laugh. "What's to figure out? It's a death trap." "No," I said firmly. "It's more than that. This isn't random. It's not just hunting us, it's playing with us." Rachel stared at me, her expression caught between terror and realization. "The journal," she whispered. "The last entry said, it's here." They knew it was coming for them. They knew they couldn't get away. Mark stood abruptly, shaking his head. "I'm not sitting here waiting to die. I say we make for the trailhead. Get out of the woods and call for help." "And leave Jessica?" I demanded. "She's already dead," Mark shouted, his voice cracking. "Whatever's in that tent, it's not letting her go." "You don't know that," I snapped, stepping toward him. "She could still be alive." "And what if she's not? What if she's like—" He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. "Like Tyler." The fire crackled, and for a moment, none of us spoke. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the trees, carrying with them fragments of words and broken laughter. My name came again, soft and seductive, like a lover's murmur. I shook my head, trying to block it out. "We need to destroy the tent," I said finally. "If it's tied to whatever's happening, maybe destroying it will break the connection." Mark frowned. "And if it doesn't?" "At least we'll have tried," Rachel said quietly. She stood, clutching her camera like a shield. "I'm with him. We can't just leave Jessica." Mark hesitated, his jaw tight. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. But we do it fast." We gathered what we could of firewood, the remaining fuel, anything that might burn. The plan was simple: get close enough to douse the tent, light it, and run like hell. But as we approached, the air grew colder, heavier, the shadows pressing against us like a living thing. The tent loomed before us, its glow flickering like a dying flame. The shadows inside were still moving, their forms grotesque and impossible, twisting in ways that defied logic. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, overlapping until they became a cacophony of sound. My name rang out again, louder this time, and I felt an invisible pull, as if something inside the tent was reaching for me. "Stay focused," Mark hissed, gripping the hatchet tightly. We stopped a few feet from the tent, the glow illuminating our faces. My heart hammered in my chest as I unscrewed the fuel canister, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Mark stood guard, his eyes darting between the trees, while Rachel snapped frantic photos, the flash cutting through the gloom. As I stepped forward to douse the tent, the flap suddenly flew open. A blast of icy wind hit me, knocking me backward. Inside the tent, the shadows solidified, coalescing into a single figure. It was Jessica, or at least, it looked like her. But her skin was pale and frostbitten, her eyes empty pits of darkness. She stared at me, her lips curling into a cold, unnatural smile. "Help me," she whispered, her voice distorted, like a recording played in reverse. I froze, my mind racing. Was it really her? Could she still be alive? The figure stepped closer, the shadows clinging to her like a second skin. "Jessica?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were sharp and wrong. "It's so cold," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Stay with me. Stay forever." Mark yanked me back, his grip like iron. "That's not her," he shouted. "Throw the fuel." I hesitated, my heart breaking as the figure reached for me, her frostbitten fingers outstretched. But Mark was right. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't Jessica anymore. I hurled the fuel into the tent, the liquid splashing across the fabric and pooling on the snow. Mark struck a match, the flame flickering weakly in the freezing air, and tossed it onto the soaked fabric. The fire roared to life, consuming the tent in seconds. The shadows writhed and screamed, their forms twisting and contorting as the flames devoured them. The figure that had been Jessica let out an ear-piercing shriek, her form dissolving into ash and smoke. For a moment, I thought we'd won. But then the whispers returned, louder and angrier than before. The fire burned hotter, the flames unnaturally bright, and the shadows began to spill out, spreading across the snow like ink. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing my arm. We fled into the forest, the shadows chasing us, their whispers deafening. The trees blurred past in a whirlwind of snow and darkness, and my lungs burned with the effort of running. Rachel was ahead of me, her camera swinging wildly as she sprinted, while Mark brought up the rear, his hatchet clutched tightly. I didn't dare look back. The whispers were right behind us, each one louder than the last, calling my name, promising warmth, peace, oblivion. When we finally reached the trailhead, the shadows stopped. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of the wind and our ragged breathing. We collapsed in the snow, too exhausted to move. But as I looked back toward the forest, I saw it. The tent was there, standing pristine and untouched, its faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat. It was waiting. And it always would be. The tent didn't burn. It stood there, pristine as if it had never been touched by fire, its faint glow mocking us from the edge of the forest. We stared at it, disbelief heavy in the frigid air. Mark was the first to speak, his voice raw and trembling. "It's not possible," he muttered. I saw it burn. We all saw it burn." "It's not just the tent," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "It's this place. It won't let us leave." I wanted to argue, to say something comforting, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew Rachel was right. Glacier National Park wasn't just a collection of trees, snow, and mountains. It was alive in a way no place should be, alive and hungry. Mark stood abruptly, the hatchet still in his hand. "We keep moving," he said. "We don't stop. We'll find the car, and we'll get the hell out of here." I nodded, though every part of me wanted to collapse in the snow and give up. The whispers had stopped for now, but the air was thick with tension, the kind that made your skin crawl. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees darker, the snow heavier, as if the wilderness itself were trying to trap us. Rachel stayed close to me as we followed the trail, her camera clutched tightly to her chest. Mark led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of our boots and the occasional snap of a branch. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain we were being followed, but the shadows remained still, for now. After what felt like hours, we reached the clearing where we'd parked the car. Relief flooded me as the SUV came into view, partially buried in snow but still there, a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. Mark sprinted ahead, fumbling with the keys in his pocket. Come on," he muttered, his breath visible in the cold air. The locks clicked, and we piled inside, slamming the doors behind us. The moment the engine roared to life, the warmth of the heater washed over me, and I felt the first flicker of hope in what felt like forever. "We're getting out of here," Mark said, his voice resolute as he gripped the wheel. "Hold on." The tires spun on the icy ground before catching traction, and the SUV lurched forward. The headlights illuminated the snow-covered road, and we sped away from the clearing, the forest blurring past us. For a moment, it seemed like we'd made it. The whispers were gone, the oppressive cold easing. But then Rachel gasped, pointing out the window. "Stop the car," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." Mark hesitated, his knuckles white on the wheel. What? What is it? Rachel didn't answer, but I followed her gaze. My stomach dropped. The tent was there, standing in the middle of the road, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Mark slammed on the brakes, the SUV skidding to a halt. The three of us sat in stunned silence, staring at the impossible sight before us. No, Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. No, no, no. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the air inside the car. My name echoed through the cacophony, twisted and broken, as if spoken by 100 voices at once. Drive! I shouted, grabbing Mark's arm. He hit the gas, swerving around the tent, but the whispers followed us, growing louder with every passing second. The air inside the car grew colder, frost creeping across the windows. I could feel something pressing against me, invisible hands gripping my shoulders, my chest, my throat. It's not letting us go, Rachel said, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her camera. It's already got us. Shut up! Mark shouted, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. We're getting out of here. The road stretched endlessly before us, the forest blurring into a suffocating haze of black and white. No matter how far we drove, the tent kept reappearing, always in the center of the road, its glow relentless. We're going in circles, I whispered, realization dawning on me. It's keeping us here. Mark slammed on the brakes again, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. Then what the hell do we do? The whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening roar. My head throbbed, my vision blurring as the cold seeped into my bones. Rachel screamed, clutching her head as the camera slipped from her hands. And then, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent, the cold receded, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I looked up, my heart hammering in my chest. The tent was gone. For a moment, I dared to hope. But then I saw her. Jessica stood in the middle of the road, her red scarf fluttering in the wind. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her lips curled into a faint, eerie smile. Jessica, I whispered, my voice trembling. She raised a hand, beckoning us. Come back, she said, her voice soft and lilting. It's so warm here. Mark shook his head, his face pale. That's not her. I knew he was right, but something about her voice, her presence, pulled at me. It was like gravity, an irresistible force drawing me closer. Rachel grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Don't, she whispered. It's what it wants. Jessica's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. Stay with me, she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Stay forever. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and I felt myself slipping. The cold gripped me, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. Shadows crept toward us, slithering across the snow like living things. Drive, I said, my voice barely audible. Mark hesitated, his hands shaking on the wheel. What if she? She's gone. I shouted, my voice breaking. Just drive. Mark slammed his foot on the gas, and the SUV roared forward, straight toward Jessica. She didn't move, didn't flinch, as the headlights swallowed her. The moment we passed through, the air grew warm again, and the whispers stopped. But the relief was short-lived. The forest thinned, revealing the parking lot where we'd started. The trailhead sign stood crookedly in the snow, and there, at the edge of the clearing, the tent waited. Its glow pulsed faintly, like a dying ember. The flap opened, and inside, I saw us, Mark, Rachel, and me, sitting around the fire, our faces pale and lifeless. The whispers returned, soft and insidious, promising warmth, peace, oblivion. And then the light went out.